Just when Canadians thought inflation was being tamed, the beast has reared its ugly head once again. After cooling down through much of this year, Canada has seen inflation start to pick up again over the past few months. After hitting a low of 2.8% in June, inflation rose to 3.3% in July and 4% in August. And it will likely rise again in September thanks to rising gas prices. It's looking increasingly likely that Canadian inflation is here to stay for the long run. That's bad news for almost every part of the economy because with inflation on the rise, the Bank of Canada is now more likely to raise interest rates even higher. That's bad news for Canada's indebted households, businesses, and government. Canada is an economy that is seriously addicted to debt, and many have suffered in the recent era of high interest rates. Homeowners paying off enormous mortgages have been praying for lower interest rates soon, and now that's beginning to look unlikely. In fact, if anything, Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem is doubling down on his war against inflation and warning borrowers that he won't end high interest rates until inflation has been beaten. Check out this recent statement from Macklem. Central bankers like Macklem speak in tongues in cautious phrases designed to obscure the truth, so after the clip, we'll translate Macklem's comment.
The overriding imperative is to ensure that high inflation does not become entrenched, because if that happens, nothing works well. This was the experience of the 1970s. The failure to control inflation resulted in high inflation and high unemployment. Labor strife increased as workers tried to cope with large increases in the cost of living. And ultimately, it took much higher interest rates and a severe recession with a large increase in unemployment to rein in inflation and re-anchor inflation expectations. That's exactly what everyone wants to avoid.
To a casual observer, there is nothing unusual about this statement, but to those who speak central banker talk, this statement raises massive alarm bells. Macklem here is comparing our era to the inflation of the 1970s. That's a warning sign, because in the 1970s, Canada and other developed countries went through a brutal bout of stagflation. Stagflation is a combination of the words stagnation and inflation, and it refers to a period of time when an economy is struggling and dealing with inflation at the same time. Technically, this isn't supposed to happen. That's because inflation usually happens when an economy is strong, or rather when there's a lot of money chasing after relatively few goods and services. In fact, that's the standard definition of inflation as coined by economist Milton Friedman: too much money chasing after too few goods, which means that inflation usually happens when there's a lot of demand in the economy at times when the supply can't keep up with the demand. But in the 1970s, the world saw a very different kind of inflation. The economy was doing badly because of a massive oil price shock in 1973, when the price of oil tripled overnight. It eventually ended up rising six-fold over 7 years. That price shock made a lot of activity uneconomical. Businesses shut down, people lost their jobs, and the economy went into a long, grim slide. The oil price shock also caused inflation to run high. To be clear, oil prices weren't the only reason for rapidly rising prices at the time. There was also the decoupling of Western currencies from the value of gold, but that's a story for another time. And to learn more, check out our recent video on the potential collapse of the US dollar. For now, suffice it to say that there were many things going on in the 1970s that were causing high inflation, while at the same time soaring oil prices were pushing the economy down. The result was a prolonged period, lasting years, in which inflation was high while the economy stagnated, which is why Tiff Macklem bringing it up at a press conference in 2023 should be alarming. The head of Canada's central bank is outright warning the country that it risks falling into another period of stagflation. But here's the thing. Today, stagflation would be much worse for the economy than it was in the 1970s. The reason for that is in the high debt levels that Canadians carry today. In the 1970s, the Bank of Canada raised interest rates to historic highs in order to bring down inflation. That hurt, but it would hurt a lot worse today because of higher debt loads. Back in 1980, the average household debt in Canada was equal to 66% of the average household income. As of 2023, the average household debt in Canada was around 185% of household income. Relative to incomes, people's debt has tripled. This makes households very sensitive to changes in interest rates, and if the Bank of Canada is going to be fighting a prolonged battle with stagflation, that means interest rates are going to stay high for a long time. That means the economic problems created by high interest rates could be far worse than what was seen in the 1970s. We could see households go bankrupt, business fold, and even the federal and provincial governments struggling with debt payments. But is Macklem serious? Will he keep interest rates high even if the housing market tanks? Even if Canadians start defaulting on their mortgages? So far, it seems the Bank of Canada governor is very serious about it. Let's go back to that statement he made.
And ultimately, it took much higher interest rates and a severe recession with a large increase in unemployment to rein in inflation and re-anchor inflation expectations.
Did you catch that? He said it took a severe recession to pull back inflation, making it clear that if this is what needs to be done, that's what the Bank of Canada will do. As central bank governor, Tiff Macklem has problems most of us don't worry about. For instance, the possible collapse of the Canadian dollar. If the Bank of Canada were to lower interest rates while inflation remains above its target range of 1 to 3%, it will signal to the global bond and currency markets that Canada has given up the fight against inflation. Two things would immediately happen. Interest rates would soar and the Canadian dollar would fall. Let's break this down. The dollar would fall because if the Bank of Canada isn't fighting inflation, that means it's letting inflation devalue the dollar. And if the Canadian dollar is going to be weaker in the future, then global currency traders don't want it. At the very least, they can buy it for less later. So currency traders dump the Canadian dollar, causing its value to fall. A weaker dollar will mean exports will be more expensive. The rise in prices of imported goods, which in Canada means everything from food to clothes to personal gadgets, will fuel inflation even further. At the same time, the country would see a big spike in interest rates. At first, this doesn't seem to make sense. After all, the Bank of Canada is signaling that the era of high interest rates is coming to an end. But the Bank of Canada doesn't actually control interest rates. It can influence them to a great extent, but its key lending rate is just the interest rate that it charges to other banks for overnight loans. Other interest rates might follow the Bank of Canada's lead to an extent, but the interest rates are mostly set by the bond markets. And if the bond markets see the Bank of Canada giving up on the fight against inflation in order to bail out indebted homeowners, traders will assume that Canada will have high inflation in the years to come, which means they will demand higher interest rates on Canadian debt. All kinds of debt, but most importantly, government debt. Buyers of government bonds will demand higher interest rates on those bonds because they will expect that inflation will eat away a lot of the interest made on that loan. Interest rates spiking after a cut in the Bank of Canada rate is what keeps Tiff Macklem up at night. If he gives up his fight against inflation before inflation cools, he could make it look as if the Bank of Canada lost control, interest rates going up even as the Bank of Canada lowers them. And worse, the Canadian dollar would fall into a devaluation spiral that would make the whole country poorer. The right way for a central bank to lower interest rates is when inflation has been beaten back. The Bank of Canada understands this, which is why Tiff Macklem is quietly telling everybody he's willing to cause a recession fighting the inflation monster. And Macklem's plan is to break the back of inflation by making it harder for Canadians to pay for things. He intends to stop inflation by holding back Canadian wage growth. Listen again to that clip.
Labor strife increased as workers tried to cope with large increases in the cost of living. And ultimately, it took much higher interest rates and a severe recession with a large increase in unemployment to rein in inflation.
Right there, he tells you what the plan is. Throw enough Canadians out of work so that wage growth is depressed, and that will put an end to it. No more labor strife, no more inflation. Whether or not that's true, whether or not it will work, is a matter of debate. The important thing is that this is what the governor of the Bank of Canada believes, and this is the road he's going down. Too much money chasing after too few goods is the cause of inflation, always and everywhere. But there are many things that can keep it going. Some economists say one of those things is the wage price spiral. They argue that in the 1970s, the era of inflation was made longer by the demands of the workers for raises. Those raises increased the cost of doing business, which businesses passed on to consumers, which meant even higher prices and therefore even more inflation. In the view of these economists, stopping inflation means stopping wage growth. And so far, things are playing out in a very 1970s fashion. As Macklem noted, labor strife is on the rise. 2023 is turning out to be the busiest year for labor action that the U.S. has seen in nearly 4 decades. Just think of the Hollywood writers and actors strikes and the United States auto workers strike against the Big Three Detroit car makers. In Canada, too, we've seen unusual amounts of strikes, from the federal workers' strike to our own Canadian auto workers' strike. Demands for wage increases are on the rise, and wage growth in Canada is now running at around 5%. That's above the 4% inflation rate, which means Canadians Canadians are making slightly more money adjusted for inflation, but that comes after several years when Canadians were seeing wage growth below inflation. And in the Bank of Canada's view, wage growth above the rate of inflation is likely to cause more inflation. Any way we slice it, the fight with inflation isn't over, and that means the struggles of indebted Canadian households aren't over either. To learn more about Canada's debt problem, check out our recent video on the illusion of wealth that debt has created in Canada. And if this video brought value to you, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.